From the very beginning, the energy in the studio felt different, almost heavier, as if everyone sensed that something unexpected was about to happen. The audience whispered among themselves, the cameras glided smoothly across the bright stage lights, and the host tried to keep his usual cheerful tone, but even he kept glancing at the side of the stage, as if waiting for a signal he wasn't used to receiving. The show was supposed to be simple. Keanu Reeves had agreed to appear for a relaxed conversation about his new project, a quiet movie with deep storytelling, but people already sensed that he seemed thoughtful, even more reserved than usual. What they did not know was that, just backstage, Keanu was standing alone with his hands lightly shaking, not because of fear, but because he was preparing to say something he had carried inside him for many years, something he never believed he would reveal in front of millions of people watching live. The moment he walked onto the stage, the entire audience rose to their feet. They cheered, clapped, and welcomed him with warmth that felt almost overwhelming. Keanu smiled softly, bowed his head in gratitude, and moved toward the chair waiting for him. But even as he sat down, people felt something different in him. Usually he carried an air of calm mystery, but tonight there was something fragile sitting just behind his eyes. He kept taking slow breaths, and when the host asked the first question, he answered gently, but his voice had a quiet tremble that was impossible to hide. The host noticed, the audience noticed, and even people watching at home felt the tension rising, as if there was a story forming beneath the surface, waiting to break open. The conversation flowed normally at first. They talked about his movie, about the emotional journey of the main character, and about the message the film wanted to share. Keanu spoke with his usual humility, always shifting attention away from himself and praising the crew, the writers, and the actors around him. He carried himself with grace, and the audience loved him for it. But then the host shifted the conversation almost casually and asked a question that seemed simple on the outside but carried enormous weight inside Keanu's heart. The host smiled and said, "We've seen you share the screen with many amazing actors, but there's one partnership people still talk about even after all these years. Your scenes with Sandra Bullock, they still feel magical. Can you tell us what made that bond so special?" For a moment, Keanu froze. The lights above him shimmered, the cameras continued recording, and the studio fell into a deep, anticipatory silence. Even the host leaned back, sensing he might have touched a sensitive place, but the question was already out there and everyone was waiting. Keanu pressed his lips together, lowered his gaze, and allowed himself a small, fragile smile. Then he inhaled deeply, and the next words he spoke changed the entire atmosphere of the show. "I love her," he said softly, his voice cracking ever so slightly. "I really love her." The audience gasped, and even the host widened his eyes, unsure whether he should speak or let the moment breathe. Keanu wasn't someone who used the word love lightly. He wasn't someone who revealed personal emotions on live television, and yet here he was, sitting under the bright lights, letting something honest and vulnerable rise to the surface after years of silence. But he didn't stop there. He leaned forward slightly, his hands intertwined, as if he were protecting something delicate inside himself. "I don't mean love in a dramatic way," he continued slowly. "I mean, she is someone who changed my life with her kindness, her strength, her humor, her heart. She showed me what real respect looks like, what real support looks like. She showed me how powerful, gentle people can be and how someone can bring light into your life without even trying." The audience melted. The host blinked several times, overwhelmed. And somewhere backstage, unseen by everyone except a few stunned crew members, Sandra Bullock herself stood frozen in place, having quietly entered the building earlier for a surprise cameo the producers had planned. She had not expected this, not his words, not this level of truth. She pressed her hand hard against her chest as her eyes began to water, and she whispered something only she could hear. "Why now, Keanu, why now?" Back on stage, Keanu continued speaking, unaware that Sandra was just a few steps away, listening to every beat of his heart. He explained how filming with her never felt like work, how every scene felt natural because she had a way of making him feel safe, seen, and appreciated. He shared how, during difficult moments in his life, she had reached out quietly, never seeking attention, never asking for anything. She simply showed up in the most human way possible. He explained how she always believed in him, even during the times when he doubted himself the most. And as he spoke, the studio began to feel like a sacred space where vulnerability was not only allowed but deeply honored. The host tried to lighten the mood with a small joke, but Keanu shook his head gently, refusing to step away from the truth he had finally allowed himself to speak. He continued by saying that people often misunderstood silence. They thought silence meant emptiness or emotional distance, but for him, Silence was a place where he protected things that mattered. Sandra was one of those things. He had kept her close in his heart, not by talking about her, but by valuing every moment, every laugh, every memory they had shared over the years. He spoke with a kind of raw honesty that made the audience lean closer, as if afraid they might miss a single breath. But the deeper he went into his confession, the more Sandra struggled to keep her emotions in check. Tears streaked down her cheeks quietly, and she brushed them away quickly, not wanting anyone else backstage to see. She wasn't crying because of the romance people always tried to attach to their story. She was crying because of the respect, the loyalty, the gratitude Keanu was finally revealing. She had always known he cared for her, but she had never known he held this level of depth, this level of silent devotion. And hearing it on live television, knowing he hadn't planned it, made her knees weak. The host finally leaned in and asked, with a voice full of curiosity, "Keanu, if you feel this deeply, why have you never said it before?" Keanu lowered his eyes again, and the audience held their breath. He took his time before answering, and when he did, his voice was softer than ever. "Because," he said, "I didn't want to complicate her life. I didn't want people to create stories that weren't true. I didn't want to take her peace away. She deserves peace. She deserves happiness. And I didn't want to be the reason anything became harder for her." The entire studio went silent, the kind of silence that felt heavy, emotional, and strangely comforting. Keanu's humility filled the air, and even people watching from home felt their hearts tighten. It was rare to witness this level of sincerity. Rare to see a man speak with such clarity about love that wasn't selfish but protective, gentle, and deeply rooted in gratitude. Just then, a soft movement backstage caught Sandra's attention. One of the producers whispered to her that her planned cameo was coming soon, but she shook her head with trembling hands. She wasn't ready to walk out there. She wasn't ready to face him after hearing everything he had said. She needed a moment to breathe, to collect herself, to understand what this confession meant for both of them. Because even though his words were beautiful, they also opened old memories, old questions, and old emotions she had kept buried for years. Meanwhile, the host returned to Keanu with another gentle question, asking whether he believed Sandra knew how much she meant to him. Keanu hesitated. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, then finally whispered, "I don't know. I honestly don't know." And that single sentence made Sandra's breath catch in her throat. She leaned against the backstage wall, her heart pounding, realizing how deeply she wanted to tell him that, yes, she knew. She had always known. But she also knew that speaking those words would change everything between them, and she was no longer sure what the world was ready for or what their own hearts were ready for. As Keanu continued speaking, he suddenly paused. Something inside him shifted, as if another layer of truth was pushing forward, asking to be revealed. He looked up at the audience, then at the host, then directly into the camera, as if speaking to someone specific. He inhaled deeply, preparing himself to reveal something he had never dared say out loud. But before he could speak, a crew member backstage accidentally brushed past a metal stand, causing a loud crash that echoed through the studio. The host jumped slightly, the audience gasped, and Keanu turned his head sharply toward the sound. And that was the exact moment Sandra stepped back into the shadows, trembling, desperate to remain unseen. Because Keanu was about to reveal the one thing that could change both of their lives forever. And the world had no idea what he was about to say next. The studio was still buzzing from the sudden crash backstage, a sharp metallic sound that shattered the delicate silence that had been forming around Keanu's confession. The audience murmured softly, unsure whether they should laugh it off or remain serious, because they could sense that Keanu had been moments away from saying something important, something raw, something that did not belong to casual conversation. Keanu sat still, his eyes fixed in the direction of the noise, his breath slowing as if he were trying to understand whether the sound had interrupted him by accident or by fate. The host attempted a nervous laugh, brushing it off as a simple backstage slip, but Keanu's expression said clearly that he didn't believe it was just that. Behind the curtains, Sandra stood completely frozen, pressing both hands over her mouth to silence the soft sob that threatened to escape. The crash had startled her too, not because of the noise itself, but because she had instinctively stepped forward right before it happened. For one terrifying second, she thought she might have been seen. She could not imagine facing Keanu in that moment, not after hearing him pour out emotions he had kept locked inside for years. She felt too exposed, too emotional, too overwhelmed by the weight of everything she had heard him say. She needed time to process the layers hidden inside his words, the heartbreak, the love, the restraint, the quiet loyalty he had carried for so long. The host leaned toward Keanu again, trying to regain control of the conversation, but his voice carried a gentle caution. Keanu, you paused before that sound. You looked like you were about to say something personal. Would you like to continue? But Keanu didn't answer right away. He sat back in his chair, hands clasped tightly, eyes drifting toward the side of the stage where Sandra had once stood during performances years ago. Something inside him felt unsettled, like he had stepped too close to a place he wasn't sure he had permission to enter. His jaw tensed slightly, and he inhaled deeply, trying to find the courage that had almost surfaced moments earlier. Finally, he spoke in a soft, steady voice. I was going to say something, but maybe the world isn't meant to hear it yet. The audience groaned softly in disappointment, sensing they had almost witnessed something unforgettable. But Keanu's expression wasn't one of fear or retreat. It was one of deep thought, as if he was protecting something fragile. Sometimes, he continued, there are truths that only belong to two people, not to the world, not to the cameras, not even to fans who mean well. Those words hit Sandra so hard that her hand slipped from her mouth, and she whispered, barely audible, two people? Keanu, what are you saying? She stepped back into the darker part of the backstage corridor, her heart pounding so loudly that she felt it echo in her ears. She knew exactly what he meant. She had always known, but hearing him say it in front of an audience pierced through her defenses in a way she had not expected. The host nodded respectfully, sensing that pushing further might break the fragile emotional balance in the room. But he did dare to ask another question, one that carried both curiosity and compassion. Keanu, do you feel like Sandra knows how important she is to you? Truly knows. Keanu's eyes softened, and he looked down at his hands, revealing the slightest shake that spoke of something deeply personal. I hope she does, he whispered, but I'm not sure. People see us laugh together on screen, they see chemistry, they see comfort, but they don't see the quiet things, the silent things that happen when no one is watching, the times she helped me when I didn't even know how to ask, the times she believed in me when I barely believed in myself. I don't talk about it because I don't want it to be misunderstood. I don't want people to twist it into something dramatic. It's something pure for me. Something that kept me going. Sandra pressed her back against the wall, her chest rising and falling unevenly. She remembered those moments he was talking about. She remembered standing with him in cold trailers between takes, offering him warmth when he seemed locked inside himself. She remembered the way he looked at her with gratitude he never voiced. She remembered how he once sent her a handwritten note after a difficult day, telling her that her kindness had saved the entire week for him. She had kept that note hidden in a drawer for years, not because she wanted to forget it, but because she didn't know what to do with something so vulnerable. Keanu continued speaking, unaware of the emotional storm he had created behind the scenes. I think maybe I never said all of this before because I didn't want to add pressure to her life. She already carries so much. She cares so deeply about everyone around her. She deserves peace, not more questions. His voice cracked again, and the audience fell completely silent. But sometimes silence can start to feel heavy, and tonight, I guess, the weight felt too much to hold anymore. The host stared at him, visibly moved. He knew this wasn't scripted. He knew Keanu had crossed into a territory that was entirely real. Do you think she'll hear you tonight? He asked quietly. Keanu looked at the camera again, and this time his gaze held a depth that made the entire studio hold their breath. I think she will, he said. I think she always hears me, even when I don't say the words out loud. Sandra covered her mouth again, tears streaming down her cheeks, her emotions too intense to control. She never expected him to speak this way. Not here. Not now. Not after so many years of both of them living quiet, separate lives. She felt something inside her shift, something she had kept buried because she didn't know how to express it without breaking the balance they had created between them. As the interview continued, the host tried shifting to lighter topics, but the mood remained heavy with emotion. The audience watched Keanu with newfound admiration, sensing that he had allowed them to witness a side of himself he rarely showed. He talked about resilience, about healing, about how kindness had been a guiding force in his life. He spoke about gratitude, humility, and how human connection mattered more than fame, success, or public image. Each word deepened the emotional thread, already tying the moment together. Backstage, one of the producers approached Sandra gently, unaware of her emotional state. We're almost at your cue, he whispered. We'll bring you out in a few minutes. Sandra's breath hitched. She wasn't ready. She didn't even know how to walk onto that stage without her emotions spilling over. Her hands trembled as she wiped her tears, trying to steady herself enough to speak. "I don't know if I can go out there," she whispered shakily. "Not right now." The producer frowned, confused, because Sandra was usually calm under pressure. But tonight, she looked like someone who had been hit by a truth she wasn't prepared to receive. And the truth was she hadn't been. She had always known Keanu cared, but she never knew he carried this level of emotional honesty inside him. The producer tried to reassure her gently, telling her that the moment would be powerful, beautiful, and unforgettable for the audience. But Sandra wasn't thinking about the audience. She was thinking about the man sitting under the bright lights, revealing a piece of his heart she didn't know he kept. On stage, Keanu sensed something uneasy in the air. He kept glancing toward the entrance where guests usually appeared, as if he felt a presence he couldn't see. He shifted in his seat, his heart pounding for reasons he could not explain. The host noticed the change in his demeanor and gently asked if everything was all right. Keanu offered a small smile and nodded, but inside something felt off. It was as if someone he cared about deeply was close by, watching silently, carrying emotions he did not yet understand. The host then asked him a question that pushed the moment even deeper. "Keanu, do you think that, after all these years, there are things between you and Sandra that were left unsaid?" This time, Keanu didn't hesitate. "Yes," he said. "Many things, and maybe I should have said them sooner, maybe I should have been braver." Sandra felt her knees weaken again. The tears wouldn't stop now. She felt seen in a way she wasn't prepared for, exposed in a moment she had not chosen, yet deeply moved by the truth unfolding in front of her. As the interview neared its final segment, the host smiled and announced a surprise for the audience. "We have someone very special backstage," he said excitedly. "Someone who has shared some of the most beautiful moments on screen with Keanu. Please welcome." Sandra's breath caught. This was it. This was the moment she feared and anticipated at the same time. She took a step forward, her heart pounding uncontrollably, tears still fresh on her cheeks. Keanu turned his head toward the entrance, his entire body tensing, sensing something monumental approaching. But before Sandra could step onto the stage, before the host could finish her name, before anyone could react, a sudden blackout hit the entire studio. The lights died. The cameras shut off. The screens went completely dark. The audience screamed softly in shock. The host stumbled, and Keanu stood up instantly, his heart racing. And in the darkness, Sandra whispered into the void, "Keanu, I'm here." The blackout came so suddenly that for a moment no one in the studio understood what had happened. 1 second the lights were warm and blinding, the cameras humming softly, the audience leaning forward in anticipation, and the next second everything vanished into thick darkness. Gasps filled the room, followed by murmurs, shuffling feet, and the uneasy rustling of hundreds of people trying to make sense of the moment. The power outage wasn't planned, it wasn't part of any show trick, and the producers backstage immediately panicked, rushing toward the control panel to find out what had gone wrong. The silence that filled the air wasn't empty. It was charged, trembling, as if holding something delicate between its fingers. Keanu stood up almost instinctively, his body tense and alert. He wasn't afraid of darkness. He had lived through enough shadows in his life to understand them well. But this darkness felt different. It felt full of eyes, full of unspoken words, full of something he couldn't yet name. He took a small step forward, listening carefully, trying to focus on any sound that might guide him. The audience had started whispering among themselves, adding layers of noise that only confused him more. The host called out gently, telling everyone to stay calm, but his voice was swallowed by the vast blanket of darkness that had fallen over the studio. And then he heard it. A soft, trembling whisper that didn't fit anywhere in the chaos. A whisper that seemed to come from the deepest part of his memory, a voice he knew better than his own heartbeat. "Keanu, I'm here." He froze, his breath caught in his chest, and for a moment the world felt painfully still. He couldn't see her, he couldn't reach for her, and he wasn't sure if his mind was creating illusions because he had spent the last half hour talking about her with an open heart. But no, the whisper felt real. It felt alive. It felt close enough to touch. He whispered back, his voice low and shaking slightly, "Sandra, is that you?" Behind the curtains, Sandra stood in the darkness, her hands trembling, her face streaked with tears she could no longer hide. She had whispered his name without thinking, without checking the room, driven purely by the raw emotion of hearing his voice crack on live TV as he confessed everything he had held inside for years. She didn't know if he heard her, didn't know if she wanted him to, but the truth had slipped out of her like a fragile secret escaping the walls of her chest. She took a step forward in the darkness, guided only by the memory of the stage layout, the sound of his breath, the pull of something deep and invisible between them. But she stopped again as fear crept into her stomach. She didn't know what she would say if she stood in front of him. She didn't know what words could possibly match the weight of everything he had confessed. She didn't know if she could face him without breaking apart. Keanu stepped closer to where he thought the whisper had come from. He didn't see her, but he could feel a presence, a soft warmth in the darkness that didn't belong to the panicking producers or the restless audience. "Sandra," he whispered again, more confidently this time, "if you're here, please say something." But Sandra remained silent, her heart beating so loudly she was afraid he could hear it even without light. She wanted to speak, but words felt too heavy, too tangled, too fragile to risk. The producers were rushing around her, trying to fix the power, unaware that a moment years in the making was trembling between two people who couldn't see each other. Meanwhile, the audience remained seated, whispering nervously, unaware that their two beloved stars were only a few feet apart, breathing in the same darkness, held together by something neither of them fully understood yet. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, emergency lights flickered on, dim, pale lights that illuminated the outlines of people but not their full expressions. The audience sighed in relief, and the host quickly regained control, assuring everyone that the team was working to restore full power soon. The cameras remained off, and the bright studio lights stayed dark, giving the room a softer, more intimate feeling. It was in this half-light that Keanu finally saw her. Sandra stood partially hidden behind a curtain, her posture tense, her breathing shaky. Even in the dim light, he saw the glimmer of tears on her cheeks. He felt something inside him break open, something he had held tightly for years. She looked smaller than he remembered, not in size but in vulnerability, as if the darkness had stripped away the polished, carefully controlled version of her that the world usually saw. Their eyes met, and for a moment neither of them moved. The host, the audience, the producers, no one noticed what was happening. This moment belonged to them alone. Keanu took one slow step toward her, unsure if she would step back or step forward. He didn't want to scare her. He didn't want to push her. He only wanted to make sure she was all right. "Sandra," he whispered gently, "why are you here?" She swallowed hard, her throat tight. "They asked me to be a surprise guest," she whispered back, her voice barely holding itself together. "I wasn't supposed to hear all of that." Keanu's expression softened even more, though the emotions swirling inside him made it difficult to breathe. "But you did," he said. She nodded, wiping her cheek with the back of her trembling hand. "Yes, I did." Keanu stepped closer, slowly closing the distance between them. "And how do you feel about it?" Sandra looked away, unable to hold his gaze. Her voice shook as she spoke. "I don't know," she said. "It was a lot, it was honest, it was beautiful, but it scared me too." He waited, giving her time, knowing better than to rush her. Sandra had always processed emotions carefully, deeply. She wasn't someone who reacted quickly. She was someone who needed to understand her own heart before speaking. She finally lifted her eyes to his. "Keanu, why now?" He exhaled slowly, because carrying it alone started to hurt. Those words hit her harder than anything he had said on stage. Her breath caught, her voice faltered, and she took a half step back, overwhelmed by the honesty he was offering her so freely. Before either of them could say another word, the full studio power suddenly returned. The overhead lights blasted on, cameras blinked back to life, screens lit up, and the entire studio gasped in surprise as everything returned to normal. But the moment, soft, raw, private, was gone. The world was bright again, and with brightness came exposure. Sandra instinctively stepped back behind the curtain, disappearing from view before anyone noticed her. Keanu turned toward the audience again, squinting under the harsh lights, trying to adjust his thoughts, his heartbeat, his emotions to the sudden shift. The host called for a quick break while the team recalibrated the equipment. Audience members stretched, whispered, laughed nervously, relieved that the blackout had passed. Meanwhile, Sandra stood behind the curtain, shaken, breathless, her chest rising and falling with the weight of everything she felt but could not say. And then her phone buzzed. She looked down, confused, and saw a single message glowing on her screen, a message from someone she hadn't expected to hear from today. Her eyes widened in shock, her lips parting as she whispered to herself, "Why would he message me now? What does he know?" She read the message again, feeling her heart drop into her stomach. And far across the stage, Keanu felt his phone vibrate with a message of his own, sent by someone whose name made his expression darken instantly. Both messages carried the same haunting sentence. "Meet me after the show. It's about Sandra." The studio slowly settled after the blackout, but something inside the atmosphere remained tense and uneven, like a quiet tremor hidden beneath the floor. The audience tried to shake off the strange moment, laughing softly, stretching their legs, whispering to one another that this episode would definitely become viral. The host reviewed his cue cards, pretending to be calm, while the producers moved like a storm behind the scenes, checking wires, replacing equipment, and arguing about what had caused such a sudden failure. But Keanu wasn't thinking about any of that. He stood near the edge of the stage with his phone held tightly in his hand, staring at the message that refused to make sense. "Meet me after the show. It's about Sandra." He read the words again and again, trying to understand why someone had chosen this exact moment, this day, this hour, this emotional storm to reach out. The name attached to the message made everything worse. It wasn't a stranger. It wasn't a fan. It wasn't someone random from the industry asking for attention. It was someone from his past. Someone who knew things he wished had never been spoken about. Someone who had been part of a chapter of his life he rarely revisited, because it carried more pain than peace. Meanwhile, only a few feet away, hidden behind the curtain, Sandra stared at her own phone with trembling hands. She had received the same message from the same person, and her heart spiraled into confusion. The name brought back memories she didn't want to touch, memories of a fragile time when she had struggled silently with heartbreak, fear, and uncertainty. Memories she thought she had buried forever. Her breath became uneven, and she whispered softly to herself, "Why now? Why reach out now?" She stepped back until her shoulder brushed against a metal frame, grounding herself with the cold sensation. She knew she had to walk back on stage soon. She knew cameras would turn to her, audiences would clap, the host would smile, and she would be expected to present herself with the calm, warm grace everyone admired her for. But inside, she felt like a storm was forming, shaking her to the core. A tap on her shoulder made her jump. It was the assistant stage manager, smiling kindly. "We're ready for you in 2 minutes," he said. "Your surprise entrance is right after the next segment." Sandra forced a nod, but inside, panic tightened her ribs. She wasn't ready. She wasn't even close to ready. The last thing she wanted was to walk out smiling right after hearing Keanu confess the most vulnerable truth of his heart, and receiving a mysterious message tied to a past she never wanted to revisit. Keanu, on the other side of the curtain, inhaled slowly, trying to keep himself present. But his mind kept racing. Who had sent that message? What did they know about Sandra? Why did they want to talk today, a day that already felt too emotionally heavy to hold? He looked toward the curtain instinctively, sensing Sandra's presence even though he couldn't see her. Something inside him tightened, not with fear, but with a fierce desire to protect her. If the message meant trouble, he needed to deal with it alone. He didn't want Sandra dragged into anything painful. The host called him back with a warm voice. "We're coming back in 30 seconds, Keanu." Keanu nodded, even though his mind was nowhere near the stage anymore. He slipped his phone into his pocket, but the message stayed heavy against his chest, like a weight he wasn't sure he could lift. The cameras turned on again. The studio lights brightened. Applause filled the room. Keanu sat back in his seat with a quiet grace, though inside he felt something unraveling thread by thread. The host smiled wide for the camera, unaware of the emotional storm brewing beneath the surface. "Welcome back, everyone," he said excitedly. "Before our final segment, we have a very special surprise for all of you. Someone beloved, someone iconic, someone who has shared unforgettable moments on screen with our guest tonight." The audience buzzed with excitement. Keanu held his breath without meaning to. The curtain moved slightly. And Sandra stepped out. The applause erupted into thunder, shaking the room. She smiled, soft, fragile, beautiful, and for a moment the world seemed to freeze. Keanu stood up instinctively, his heart crashing in his chest, not because he hadn't known she was coming, but because her presence, combined with the message they had both received, created a strange, emotional knot that neither of them knew how to untangle. Sandra walked toward him with warm eyes, though they glistened slightly from emotions she had fought hard to hide. When she reached him, they embraced. It wasn't a dramatic hug. It wasn't romantic. It was something deeper, an embrace of familiarity, of years of unspoken comfort, of shared memories and quiet support that had grown between them long before today. The host gestured for them to sit. and the audience leaned forward, eager to witness the reunion they had always dreamed of seeing live. But as Sandra sat beside Keanu, her hand brushed lightly against his, and in that brief touch he felt her tremble. He looked at her quietly, concern rising like a tide inside him. He wanted to ask if she was okay. He wanted to tell her he had seen her tears in the darkness. He wanted to protect her from whatever message awaited them after the show. But the cameras were rolling, so he stayed silent. The host began asking questions, light and playful ones about their old movies, their laughter on set, their friendship that had lasted decades. They answered with smiles, laughter, gentle teasing, and fond memories. The audience adored every second. But underneath their words, an invisible tension pulsed, only visible in the way Sandra kept glancing down at her hands, or how Keanu kept swallowing as if trying to stabilize his breath. The host then asked a question that shifted the air again. You two have always had incredible chemistry. Fans always wonder, did you ever think about taking that connection off screen? Sandra froze subtly. Keanu exhaled slowly. The audience held their breath. Sandra spoke first, though her voice felt like it had to push through layers of hesitation. We cared about each other a lot, she said softly. We still do. That never changed. Keanu looked at her, and for a moment something raw flickered between them, too delicate for the world to hold. The host continued, and after hearing what Keanu said earlier, how does it feel to know he holds so much love and respect for you? Sandra's throat tightened. She wanted to speak. She wanted to acknowledge the beauty of his words, the years of unspoken connection, the silent protection he had given her without asking for anything in return. But the message on her phone weighed on her heavily. She forced a small smile and said, his words were overwhelming and kind, very kind. Keanu watched her closely. He recognized her tone. He knew when she was hiding something, when her heart was trying to speak, but her mind wasn't ready. He wanted to reach for her hand under the table and tell her she didn't have to face anything alone, not tonight, not anymore. The interview ended with applause so loud it almost shook the floor. The host thanked them, the cameras faded out, and the studio lights dimmed to end the show. As soon as the applause died and the microphones turned off, Sandra stood up quickly, unable to hold her composure any longer. She stepped away from the stage before anyone could stop her, her breath uneven, her mind spinning. Keanu followed her immediately. Sandra, he called quietly, not wanting to attract attention. She stopped but didn't turn around. He walked closer, his voice soft but firm. I know you got a message from the same person who contacted me. She finally turned, her eyes full of fear and confusion. Keanu, what if they know something? What if they say something we aren't ready to face? He shook his head gently, then we face it together. Her eyes softened, and for the first time that night, she allowed herself to breathe. But before they could speak further, a studio assistant rushed toward them. Excuse me, she said nervously. The person who messaged you, he's already here. He said it's urgent. He's waiting outside. Keanu and Sandra exchanged a slow, tense glance. Neither spoke. Neither breathed, because they both knew this was not a coincidence. Something from their past had returned, and whatever this person had to say, it was about to change everything. The hallway outside the studio felt strangely cold, as if the air itself knew something heavy was about to unfold. The bright lights from the set no longer touched this part of the building, and shadows stretched across the walls in long, quiet shapes. Keanu and Sandra stood side by side, their breaths unsteady, their hearts thudding with a rhythm neither of them could calm. The assistant who delivered the message hurried back toward the stage, leaving them alone in the hallway with only the soft hum of distant machines and the faint echo of people packing up equipment. Sandra rubbed her hands together, trying to steady the trembling she could no longer hide. Keanu noticed instantly. He stepped a little closer, not touching her but offering silent comfort through presence alone. We don't have to go out there right away, he said softly. We can take a minute. But Sandra shook her head. If we wait, it will only get harder. Her voice was gentle, but the fear inside it was unmistakable. She felt as if she had stepped back into a part of her life she thought she had closed forever, a chapter she never planned to revisit. And now the past was standing just outside the building, waiting for her. Keanu's eyes softened with concern. He didn't want her to face anything painful alone. I'm right here, he said quietly. Whatever this is, we face it together. Those words made her chest tighten, almost painfully, but in a strangely comforting way. She nodded slowly, letting herself breathe in his calm strength. For years, he had been a quiet anchor in her life, someone whose presence made even the hardest moments less terrifying. But tonight, the weight of what might be coming made her feel fragile again. They walked together toward the exit, their footsteps soft and synchronized on the polished floor. As they approached the glass doors, Sandra's stomach twisted. She slowed down unconsciously, her breath catching as the outside world came into view. A tall figure stood near the parking lot, illuminated by the orange glow of a flickering street lamp. His posture was stiff, almost tense, and although his face was shadowed, Sandra recognized the silhouette instantly. Her heart dropped. Keanu felt her stop beside him. He turned to look at her face, and the anguish in her expression told him everything he needed to know. "You know who that is?" he whispered. She nodded, her eyes filling again with emotion she didn't want to release. "Yes," she breathed. "I know." Keanu held her gaze for a moment, searching her expression for something. Regret, fear, anger, anything. What he found instead was something far more complicated. A mixture of old wounds and quiet strength. A story she had never told him fully because some scars were too deep for casual conversation. He touched her arm gently. "You don't have to speak to him if you don't want to." Sandra inhaled slowly, lifting her chin just slightly. "I need to know why he called us here. Why now, after all these years?" Keanu nodded, though the tension in his jaw betrayed how much he hated seeing her shaken like this. If he could have shielded her from this moment, he would have. He would have taken every weight from her shoulders and carried it himself if it meant she could breathe easier. But this was her past, not his. He could only stand beside her and walk through it with her. They pushed open the glass door, and the cold night air rushed over them like a sudden wave. The man turned slowly when he heard the door open. His eyes found Sandra first and then Keanu. He looked older than they remembered, more tired, more worn, as if life had carved uncertainty into every line on his face. But his gaze still carried an intensity, familiar and unsettling. "You came," he said softly, almost surprised. Sandra swallowed hard. "You asked us to." The man took a slow step forward, but Keanu subtly shifted his stance, placing himself just slightly in front of Sandra. Not aggressively, just protectively. The man noticed. He gave Keanu a small nod of acknowledgement, as if he understood the unspoken message. "I'm not here to cause problems," the man said. "I'm not here to hurt anyone. I reached out because I found something I think you should see." Sandra's throat tightened. Memories she had spent years avoiding suddenly pressed against her mind, memories of a time when she felt lost, unsure, and vulnerable. The man standing in front of her had been part of that period, part of the confusion she had fought so hard to move beyond. She forced herself to stay calm, but her fingers curled slightly in fear. Keanu stepped forward, his voice steady. "What is this about? Why involve Sandra now?" The man looked down at the ground for a moment, then lifted his eyes again. There was no arrogance in his expression, no smugness, only a strange mixture of regret and urgency. "Because someone's been watching her," he said quietly, "and watching you." Sandra felt the blood drain from her face. "What do you mean watching?" The man reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope, worn at the edges. He held it out to them with a shaking hand. "I didn't know if it was real at first. I didn't want to believe it. But after what happened the last few months, after everything resurfaced, I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore." Sandra didn't reach for the envelope. Her hands were shaking too much. Keanu took it instead, his fingers steady as he opened the flap and pulled out the contents. What he saw inside made his entire body stiffen. Photographs. Taken from a distance. Taken without their knowledge. Sandra outside her home. Keanu leaving a meeting. The two of them together at a private dinner years ago. Sandra hugging her children. Keanu visiting a quiet memorial spot he never shared publicly. Keanu clenched the photos in his hand, fury rising like a wave he struggled to contain. "How long has this been happening?" he demanded. The man ran a hand through his hair, shaking. "Longer than I realized. Whoever's doing this, they're not a fan. They're not a reporter. They know too much. They get too close." Sandra felt her heart pounding so loudly that her ears rang. The idea of someone watching her family, her private moments, her quiet life, without her knowing, filled her with a fear she hadn't experienced in years. "Why come to us now?" Keanu asked, his voice low, desperate for answers. The man hesitated, then said something that made Sandra's knees weaken. Because they contacted me. They want something from you both, and they're not going to stop until they get it. Sandra's breath hitched, and she pressed her hand to her mouth. Keanu stepped closer to her instinctively, his entire body tensing like a shield. What do they want? Keanu asked sharply. The man looked directly at Sandra, his voice barely above a whisper. They want the truth you two never told the world, the one thing you've both been protecting all these years. Sandra staggered back, her eyes widening in horror. Keanu grabbed her arm gently to steady her. What truth? He demanded. The man looked at them with tired eyes. The truth about what happened between you, the truth you both buried, the truth someone is now threatening to expose. Sandra shook her head slowly, her voice cracking in panic. No, that can't be happening, not now, not after all this time. Keanu pulled her close, his voice shaking with a mixture of anger and fear. Whoever this is, they're not going to hurt you, I promise you that. But even as he said it, he felt a cold dread sink into his stomach. Because deep inside, he knew there was only one truth this stranger could be referring to. One truth that neither he nor Sandra had ever dared to speak aloud. And now someone else knew. For a long moment, no one spoke. The cold night air wrapped around them like a heavy curtain as Sandra and Keanu stood frozen, staring at the man who had brought their buried past to the surface. Sandra's breath came in short, shaky waves, and Keanu held her arm gently, grounding her with a steady presence she desperately needed. The man shifted uncomfortably under their gaze, as if the weight of what he had just revealed was too much even for him to hold. Sandra finally found her voice, though it trembled like a broken thread. How could anyone know? Her words cracked, raw with fear and disbelief. We never told anyone, no one was there, no one heard, no one saw. The man lowered his eyes, shame pressing down on him. I didn't believe it at first either, he said softly. But whoever this person is, they've been digging into your past, into your life, Keanu, and into yours, Sandra. They know things people shouldn't know unless they had access to something private, something recorded, something hidden. Keanu felt his entire spine tighten. He stepped forward, his voice low, controlled, but burning with quiet fury. What exactly do you think they found? The man swallowed hard and looked up at them. The footage. The world seemed to stop. Sandra staggered back, her hand flying to her mouth as tears filled her eyes. Keanu's chest tightened so painfully he had to force air back into his lungs. He hadn't heard that word in decades. He thought all traces of that night, of the moment they had shared in vulnerability, confusion, and honesty, were gone forever. But the man standing in front of them had just confirmed their deepest fear. The man continued, his voice breaking. I didn't know it existed, you didn't know it existed, but someone somewhere recorded that moment, the moment the two of you finally told each other the truth. Sandra closed her eyes and shook her head, as if trying to shake the memory free from her body. But it came rushing back anyway, an old hotel room years ago, the two of them sitting on the floor, the weight of fame pressing down on their shoulders as they finally confessed the emotions they had no idea how to carry. She remembered the tears, the trembling hands, the quiet laughter through pain, the feeling of relief and heartbreak mixing together. They hadn't kissed, they hadn't crossed any line. But they had said things that were meant only for each other, things that carried too much honesty for the world to understand without twisting them into something messy and cruel. Keanu stared at the ground for a long moment, then lifted his gaze with a steady, protective calm. Tell us everything. How did you get involved? The man explained that months ago, he had been contacted by someone claiming to have sensitive material involving Sandra. At first, he thought it was a scam. Then he received a blurred screenshot, one that showed Sandra crying softly while Keanu held her hand. A private, intimate moment that should never have existed outside their memory. The man had panicked. He didn't know what to do. Instead of coming to them, he tried to handle it on his own. But the more he tried, the deeper the stranger dug. Then the messages changed. They wanted something, money, information, leverage. And when the man refused, the threat grew bigger. They wanted exposure. They wanted scandal. They wanted to reveal everything about that night. Keanu felt a quiet rage building inside him, not wild or explosive, but protective, sharp, and controlled. So that's why you came to us now, because they're getting closer. The man nodded helplessly. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, I didn't know what else to do. Sandra sank onto a nearby concrete bench, her shoulders shaking with silent tears. Keanu sat beside her, not touching her at first, giving her a moment to breathe. After a long silence, she whispered, "I don't want to relive that night through someone else's eyes. It was ours, Keanu. It was supposed to stay ours." He nodded, his voice almost breaking. "I know, and I won't let anyone use it against you. Not now, not ever." Sandra lifted her eyes to him. "Why does this keep happening? Why can't the past stay in the past?" Keanu exhaled slowly. "Because we never closed it. We walked away from that moment, but we never talked about it again. We buried it, thinking it was safer that way." Her tears fell harder. "I was scared, Keanu. I didn't know how to carry it. I didn't know what you wanted. I didn't know what I wanted." Keanu gently touched her hand, the gesture full of years of unspoken understanding. "I was scared too." The man stepped forward cautiously. "I think the only way to stop this is to take away the threat. If the truth isn't a secret anymore, they have no power." Sandra looked horrified. "You mean tell the world? No, no, we can't do that. People will twist it. They'll turn it into something ugly." Keanu looked at her gently. "There's another way." She blinked, confused. "What way?" He turned fully to her, his eyes soft but unwavering. "We tell the truth to the people who matter, not the world, not the media, the people in our lives, the ones who trust us, the ones who won't twist anything." He held her gaze. "We take control of our story before someone else does." Sandra's lips parted, trembling. "But what if telling the truth breaks everything?" Keanu shook his head slowly. "Truth doesn't break what's real. Lies do, fear does, silence does, but truth can heal." She felt something warm and painful spread through her chest. Keanu had always been like this, gentle, thoughtful, steady. He never pushed her. He never pressured her. He gave her space to breathe, to choose, to find her own voice. She realized then that everything he said on live TV wasn't just a confession, it was a promise. He had loved her quietly, respectfully, without ever asking for anything in return. The man stepped back, giving them space as he waited for their decision. And that's when Sandra finally spoke the words she had been holding back for years. "The truth is that night, Keanu, I loved you too." Keanu's breath caught. The world around them seemed to fade into silence. She continued, her voice trembling but clear. "I loved you in a way I didn't know how to explain. I loved you enough to walk away because I didn't want to ruin what we had. I didn't want to confuse you. I didn't want to confuse myself. And I didn't think I deserved the kind of love you were offering." Keanu closed his eyes, the weight of her confession washing over him like a warm tide. He opened them again, tears gathering quietly. "I never stopped caring about you," he whispered. "I carried that night with me for years, not as regret, but as something that taught me how precious you are." Sandra reached for his hand this time, holding it with a tenderness she had never allowed herself to show before. "So what do we do now?" Keanu looked at her with a soft, steady certainty. "We stop hiding, not for them, not out of fear, but because we deserve peace." The man watched them silently, tears at the corners of his eyes, knowing he had witnessed something rare. Keanu squeezed Sandra's hand gently. "We tell the truth to the people who matter, and we protect the rest together." Sandra exhaled slowly, feeling something inside her finally loosen. The fear, the weight, the silence. She nodded. "Together," she whispered. And as the night air wrapped around them, filled with uncertainty but also quiet hope, Sandra leaned into Keanu's shoulder, allowing herself to rest there for the first time in years. Whatever came next, threats, exposure, healing, it would be faced side by side. The past no longer owned them. The truth no longer frightened them. And somewhere deep in the quiet space between their hearts, something old finally began to heal.